Okay.
Right. That means we're gonna start.
We're going to start. We're only a few minutes late. We're good. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. Again, this is the Murray Amateur Radio Club. And let me get back to my presentation. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, we had this class where we talked about slinging the lingo, understanding the old men. And as we were proceeding through the class, we covered the NATO alphabet. We covered some words you'll hear on the radio, and we had an awful lot of conversation, and that's about as far as we got. So I actually had like 19 slides here, and I think we made it to this one right here, which was slide number 8. So first, does anybody want to rehash anything from 2 weeks ago? There is one thing that I wanted to rehash that we talked about on the net, but we didn't talk about it in here. Talking about the phonetic alphabet. And I had indigo, which for whatever reason, my brain had decided was the correct word for I, but the accepted word apparently is India. And in research, I found that indigo is used by the British police force. So that's apparently the only group that uses it. And I'm going to say, yes, I was born in England. Yes, I am British, semi. My mom was British and I am half British. But that's no excuse. I should have known better. But anyway, so anyhow, yeah, so that was an interesting factor that we talked about. We hashed it out a couple of weeks ago. And we Paul and I figured this out in an email conversation and realized that it is actually India, and he was correct. So kudos to Paul.
Only half British. That means you say indigo only halfway. Indy.
Okay, Indy. So India. Yeah, Dan says since I'm half British, I only have to say half of indigo. So Indy. Or I go, I guess, and just leave, right?
Yeah. Had something come up last night in the 10-meter net.
You want to come up so the microphone can pick you up? Yeah, we don't.
You're technical for us.
That failed, right? So
we had something come up last night on the 10-meter net that I thought might be interesting to mention in this context. And that is that there is another international alphabet out there that uses primarily the names of countries. And it occurs to me that I've heard people on HF, sometimes when conditions were difficult, use parts of 2 or 3 different phonetic alphabets. If someone's not understanding Zulu, they might understand Zanzibar. So you need to, I almost hate to give this advice because you don't want to learn 2 and mix them up. But it might be worth keeping a card handy if you're ever in that situation, because a lot of foreign stations still use the one that's based on country names.
Some people just make it up.
That's right. Yes, I'm always excited for kilowatt radios.
yes, yes.
So
I heard a guy use that just the other day as well, and it was like, oh, and he was like, he used the non-correct words for every letter of his call sign. And I'm sure if there had been one for the digit, he would have used the wrong one for that as well. But no, it was frustrating to me, especially after the class, because I was like, wait, we just talked about this, you know, and it wasn't a member of the club that was doing it. It was a guy I heard on the Farnsworth repeater talking with David. You might have heard him too, Paul. I don't know you. I know you monitor that repeater a lot.
You know, we always have it mixed up anyway, because I mean, how many different names do they use for Z?
For which? For Z?
Z. It's supposed to be Zulu, but you hear Z and you hear.
Well, Z is just the name of the letter. So that's why I use Z, for example. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago too, where pretty much every country other than the US says Z instead of Z. And in fact, I wanted to show you guys this. And let me see if I can
But it's
pull
French.
it up.
That's why we don't do it here.
Right, yeah.
We have the French to blame on that.
Okay.
Their own paper fuselage.
That's right.
Let me just pull this up real fast because you guys will get a kick out of this. So on the club website, let me pull this up over here. Ooh, that's really hard to see. Let's see if we can make it bigger. On the club website, I have a page. Well, that didn't help. No, if I do that, it'll take over and it'll screw up my presentation and everything will go weird. But if I can grab it at the right place, maybe I can grab it. If I could see what I was doing, I could grab it. For those of you not in the room, I'm like looking over my shoulder at this thing, trying to see this. There we go. So this is the phonetic alphabet that I came across. And so, you know, we're all familiar with the phonetic alphabet, which is here. And in fact, I have indigo. Look at that.
On the internet, it must be true.
This is, I posted this like a couple of years ago. So the phonetic alphabet looks like this. So we have A as in R, B as in B, C as in sight, D as in W, E as in I, F as in 5, G as in genre, H as in ho, I as in I, J as in junta, K as in not, L as in lie, M as in me, N as in 9, O as in O, P as in pseudonym, Q as in Q, R as in rap, S as in C, T as in tsunami, U as in understand, V as in vi, W as in Y, X as in xylophone, Y as in U, and Z as in 0. I suggest you do not use this alphabet. Please do not use this alphabet on the radio. Although for a good time, it might be fun to do sometime. The next time you hear somebody say they're kilowatt 7, whatever, right? Give your call sign as, yes, my call sign is not W7 0Y Vi. That would be fun, right? That would maybe wake them up a little bit and help them to understand the error of their ways. But this is actually, this is on the website. So if you want to check it out, if you search for phonetic or phony, you'll find this. And yeah, it was something that I put together a while ago because I remembered seeing it and I thought that would be fun to share with people. I think they will enjoy that. Yeah, T is in tsunami, right? Yeah. So okay, so anyway, let's go ahead and get started back into the presentation. So the next thing that we were going to talk about was Q codes. And we actually had a presentation on Q codes back in January of 2021. And the recording of that is on the website. So if you want to check that out, that presentation actually went way in depth on Q codes. We're going to talk about some, but we're not going to talk about all of them. We're going to talk about the ones you're likely to hear on repeaters or on VHF, right? So Q codes are short codes. They're typically 3 letters. They start with the letter Q. Why do they start with the letter Q? There will never be a call sign that starts with the letter Q. Okay. So if you hear something that starts with Q, you know it's not a call sign. They originated back in the Morse code days. People used them to have to type or have to key less, right? So if you could use a short 3-letter code that everybody understood had a particular meaning, then you didn't have to key in the entire length of the full question or answer, right? It's a shorthand for common questions, answers, and phrases. And typically in Morse code, it might be followed by a question mark if you're asking the question, or without the question mark if you're answering the question. And that'll become more clear as we get into what some of them are. You'll hear them a lot on HF, but there are some that you will hear on repeaters. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So you'll hear, these are ones that I have heard on the repeaters around here. So I know some of these you probably don't hear too often, but if you hear this will help you to understand what the heck they're talking about. So your QTH is your house, your home, your base of operations, wherever you reside. So you'll hear people on the radio say things like, "What's your QTH?" And sure, they could just say, "Where do you live?" But it's much cooler to say, "What's your QTH?" Right? So you got to stick with the cool factor. Got to stay on track with the cool factor. So you would answer that by saying something like, "My QTH is Murray," right? Or "I live in Murray." Might as well just answer it, right? You'll hear people talk about a QSO or a QSO. QSO is a conversation. So anytime you make a radio contact with somebody, that's a QSO, okay? And you'll hear people talking about, well, I had a QSO with so-and-so the other day, and what they're talking about is they talked to them on the radio. You'll also hear people mention an eyeball QSO, which means they actually saw them with their eyeball. So like if Dave and I were having a conversation together and, you know, we went to lunch or something, that would be an eyeball QSO. We actually talk to each other without using the radio. Another one you'll hear is QSY. In fact, I think, was that you, Dan, who just said QSY a minute ago? Dan said if he heard people using the phonetic alphabet on the air, he would QSY. And QSY means just change frequencies. So on Morse, you'll hear people do, they'll say like QSY question mark, and someone else will say QSY plus 10 or something like that. Change frequency up 10 kilohertz or 10 whatever, right? So basically it just means you're going to change frequencies or change repeaters. Usually it's asked as a question. I can hear you on the input. So remember we talked about hearing people on the input a couple of weeks ago? That means you're close enough that you can talk simplex. You don't need to be tying up the repeater. So you might say, I can hear you on the input QSY to a simplex frequency. Oh yeah, let's go to 5.2 or something like that. Probably shouldn't use 5.2 because that's the calling frequency, but that's just the first simplex frequency I pulled out of my hat. So other times you might have a QSY is somebody wants to use the repeater for a net or something. You're sitting there talking and someone comes on and says, "Hey, is this repeater in use?" You say, "Oh yeah, we're having a conversation over here. Oh, we've got a net starting in 5 minutes. Oh, well, that's okay. We'll QSY over to the Farnsworth repeater or to some other repeater and continue our conversation there." Right? So you'll hear it used in that context. QRM is one that you don't hear too much on VHF. You hear it mostly on HF, but you might hear it. I've heard it on the repeater before. And basically QRM is noise. And there's actually two different kinds of noise, right? There's QRM and QRN. And I only wrote QRM here because generally when people talk about noise, they talk about QRM. But the difference is QRM is man-made noise, or like noise caused by your equipment or something like that, maybe, or other people transmitting. QRN is natural noise. So like if there's a thunderstorm or something like that, lightning can cause noise on the frequency, right? So you may be affected by that. You may be, "Oh, sorry, I've got too much QRN. I can't make out what you're saying. Let's try again tomorrow," or whatever, right? Or, "Man, you've got a lot of QRM from your signal. It sounds like you need a choke on your power line because you're picking up what is it, alternator noise, or what's the word I'm looking for?
Power line noise.
Noise, like I'm thinking from the car, like you'll hear the ignition system noise, right? So on a mobile radio, sometimes depending on how you have it set up, you might be picking up noise from the ignition system. And that would be QRM that people are hearing when you're trying to talk. And so they might tell you, "Hey, you have QRM. It sounds like your ignition system." Solution for that is typically to put a choke on the power line where it comes into the radio, and that will block that signal typically.
Most of my QSOs are QRM.
Dan says most of his QSOs are QRM. So that's next time Dan wants to talk to you on the radio, just say, "Hey, no." Anyway, so QRZ or QRZ, if you're American. Technically, it means who is this? But a lot of times nowadays, when we talk about QRZ, we're talking about the website QRZ.com. If you're not familiar with QRZ.com, you should check it out. Basically, they keep a database of call signs. Now, you may be thinking, well, the FCC has a great database of call signs. That's fabulous. But what if you hear somebody with a non-US call sign? That's not going to be in the FCC database. But QRZ has a lot of other databases pulled in, plus people have entered their own call sign, so that information is there. Plus, you will find sometimes biographical information about people. You'll find, something about their history or how they got into radio or something like that. You might find pictures of them or their equipment. QRZ is a pretty cool site. One thing is, if you want to use QRZ, you really need to create an account on QRZ, because it hides a lot of things from you if you're not logged in. So keep that in mind. For example, I don't think it'll even show you their name if you're not logged in. And I know it won't show you like their email address or something like that if you're not logged in, or the physical address. So we can take a look at QRZ if we have time at the end. I'll pull it up and we can poke around in a little bit, but it's pretty good. There are other sites out there that do the same thing. I'm just more familiar with QRZ. That's the one I usually use. So it's free unless you want to pay for more enhanced access. You can pay for an API access and things like that. You may want to use that if your logging software has a way to integrate with QRZ. We can talk about that another time. It's kind of out of scope for this meeting. But technically, QRZ means who is this? So you would say, if you hear somebody talking and they did an ID, you could say, hey, QRZ. And that's kind of reminding them, oh, I should probably ID myself, right? So, or at least say who I am, or run away and turn the radio off if I don't want to, if I said something bad about somebody and I don't want them to know it was me. Anyway, so QRZ, typically we're talking about the website. QSL is one that you will hear. Basically, it's saying, hey, is the frequency in use? And you'll often hear that before the start of a net. Go ahead, Paul.
That's not right.
Is it
I think that's QR.
QRL.
QRL? All right. I stand corrected. QSL is, so what is,
Well, in CW, and without a question mark, and someone's calling you and you usually follow the call sign, you would be followed by it. If it's followed by a question mark, it means can you confirm what I just said?
I can't edit it right now, unfortunately. So QRL is the one that we're talking about. That's the one that means is the frequency used. I will fix this slide before we publish this. QSL, as Paul points out, is I sent you something, did you receive it? Or yes, I received it, right? So, and you'll hear about QSL cards, which are physical pieces of paper that people will mail back and forth. There are also virtual QSL cards that you can do completely online. We can talk about that in another meeting. It's kind of out of scope for this one, but yeah.
To also talk about logbook and QRZ.com's logbook.
I know we have talked about logging. We've talked about this in the context of logging before, and we have a presentation on logging on the site, but we should certainly revisit that. And then the last one I have here is QST, which is general call to all stations. Basically, you might use this if you're going to shut the repeater down for maintenance or something. It's a general call. It's not like I'm calling a specific station. I'm basically calling everybody who might be listening. Typically, we don't do that in ham radio. We do directed calls. We call somebody, and that's why we call CQ, because when you don't know who you're calling, you say CQ to refer to the generic station, right? In this case, you're specifically making a statement that needs to be heard by everybody. So QST is kind of like an attention getter. It says, hey, pay attention. This is an important message coming out. The repeater's going down, something like that. You'll hear that one on the repeater sometimes.
For you networking people, it's a .255.
A broadcast, yeah. Yeah.
CQ, y'all.
Yeah, something along those lines, right?
Sometimes it's used like 5 minutes before that. Sometimes somebody will say QST. QST means a bulletin. Calling all amateurs basically. And you can remember because that's how the magazine guys.
Right. So Paul points out that sometimes you'll hear this like 5 minutes before the net. Hey, QST, net starting in 5 minutes. And the Q code means that it's a bulletin or a message to all amateurs, right? Or all operators. And there is a QST magazine that the ARRL puts out that is mailed out to all members. Well, except ones that aren't subscribing to that magazine and are now subscribing to one of the other magazines. But back in the day, there was only the one magazine. And so if you join the ARRL, you would receive the QST magazine in the mail every month. And that was basically sent out to all amateurs.
You will also hear QST every once in a while on Utah SAG events or any time when they do a general announcement. QST, all operators starting in 5 minutes.
Dan points out that you may hear this at an event. Utah SAG does this on occasion where if they have a message that needs to go out to all stations rather than calling each station individually and relaying it, they would say QST, all stations take note, whatever, right? The race has been called on account of rain or something, please go home now. But yeah, so you'll hear QST on the repeaters. Oh, jeepers. Come on. Okay. So the next one we're going to talk about is Prosigns. So Prosigns are a little different from Q codes. They are short for procedural signs, and they also originated back in the days of wired telegraphy. They're usually short 2-letter, 2-digit codes. There are a few single character codes. There are a few 3-character codes. I think there's even a couple of 4-character codes out there. You probably won't hear those very much. There are a few that you will hear on the repeaters. We're going to talk about those in a sec. So what these codes are is typically you would take a couple of letters and you just run them together in Morse code as a single character. So rather than having the space in between the 2 letters, you just run them all together. So instead of sending ... dash for SSS, you just send ... dash all as one sequence. Okay. So SOS obviously is one of them. They're used to send a commonly used message. And we also talked about Prosigns in our Q code class that we had a couple of years ago. We talked about Prosigns and brevity codes. And a lot of times you can think of a brevity code as being a similar thing to a Prosign, but brevity codes are more application specific, I want to say. So we won't really talk about the difference between them. We'll just kind of lump them all together for the purposes of this conversation. Good gracious. Why are you doing this to me? Okay. So these are ones that you're likely to hear on the repeaters. You'll hear 73. Okay. And how many people have heard 73 on the radio? Everybody's hand should go up, right? If you've ever listened to the radio and heard a QSO or QSO going on, you've probably heard 73 at the end of it. 73 stands for best regards. Now, sometimes you will hear people say 73s, and technically that is incorrect. Nobody's going to complain about it or care about it too much, but that's like saying best regards is, and you wouldn't do that in normal conversation. So you probably don't want to do that on the radio either. But 73rds. Typically you'll hear 73 or 73 or some variant of that. And it's basically just a way you might use that at the end of your conversation to say, hey, have a great day. See you later. And, that'll be like one of the last things you say. A corollary to that is 88, which stands for hugs and kisses. Now, I suggest you're careful who you say 88 to. You can certainly say it to your XYL or your YL. Remember, we talked about your XYL and your YL before. We're going to talk about it again in a second. Or your OM if you're of that bent. But
Say it to a YL, your XYL, maybe your XXYL.
That's correct. Yeah, Paul points out if you say it to a YL, your XYL may become your XXYL. Okay, so We'll skip the next one and go straight to YL so that people know what the heck we're talking about. YL stands for young lady, and your XYL is no longer a young lady, she's your wife now. So in the interest of not being sexist, I have heard YM for young man and XYM for husband before. I've never heard them on the air, but I have heard them described before. Maybe, I don't know where. Yeah, at a rally of a certain category of people who we will not talk about. Anyway, so that's what YL, when we're talking about your YL, you don't say 88 to your YL or your XYL, but you're not going to say it to Dan, for example, unless you're Mrs. Dan, right? Okay, so CQ is another one. CQ we use more QRM. CQ is basically any station. That's another one of those that we will use because we're not supposed to send out broadcast messages. We're supposed to send out directed conversations. And CQ is when you don't know who is on the other end yet, you're trying to establish a contact, right? So you might say or hear CQ and then your call sign. And that's basically saying, hey, anybody out there who wants to talk to me. Now, there is a very common understanding that you don't say CQ on repeaters. Has anybody ever said anything? You know, Paul's giving me this funny look right now because he's thinking, why would you not say CQ on the repeater? And that's exactly my point as well. But sometimes you will hear people complain that you shouldn't say CQ on the repeater. And I've always felt like, hey, if I want to talk to somebody, I should say CQ. These people are the ones who you will hear say their call sign followed by monitoring, which to me means I know my radio works and I have it turned on. I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm just listening, right? So if you want to talk to someone, say CQ for crying out loud. It's fine. Don't feel bad. If anybody hassles you about it, tell them to talk to me, and I'll set them straight. So I think it's perfectly valid to call CQ on the repeater. What's that?
That's a lot of weight.
Yeah. Well, I think it's perfectly fine to call CQ on a repeater. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't do that.
I think where there is a distinction is don't call it 9 times in a row like you're you know, on HF and maybe not heard.
Okay, that's true. Paul makes the observation that you shouldn't call it like 9 times in a row. When you're on HF and you're trying to find somebody, you're going to pick up the mic and you're going to say, CQ, 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 this is KD7ZWB, CQ, 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 all without a break, without stopping, right? Because people tuning by will maybe see that on their waterfall or they'll hear it as they tune past and they'll stop and come back to you. On repeaters, you don't have that problem. So you can just say, hey, CQ, KD7ZWB on the repeater, and that's good enough. Anybody who's listening is going to hear that. On HF, also, you can hear multiple people talk at once, which can sometimes be confusing, but you might hear somebody saying CQ while you're listening to another conversation. And in that case, that may indicate to you, hey, we should move our frequency a little bit one way or the other, or something like that. You don't have that problem on VHF where you're on FM. So here I have OM, old man. And remember, our slide deck was called Understanding the Old Men. So who's the old men? We are. We're the old men. Even Dan is the old man.
I just turned 40.
So basically an old man is another operator. And I have heard YM for young man. I have heard people use that in conversation. I haven't heard that on the radio, but I have heard it used. But typically when you're talking about another operator, you're talking about an OM. Now, if you're talking about a female operator, you probably don't want to call them an OM. Just to be cognizant of that fact. You might call them an OL, but again, most females don't like to be called old, so you probably should avoid that too. Be politically correct when you use these phrases, right? So, okay.
Look at the name before you send it.
That doesn't always work. Witness my name.
KJ7 Elizabeth does a lot of CW, and she said she frequently gets 73 OM
Ah,
at the end of the contact.
yeah, because you can't tell, there's no voice on CW. Paul points out that you may hear this used on CW more than otherwise. And he brings up a female operator that he knows who hears OM at the end of a conversation with them on Morse code. Obviously, they have no idea from her call sign that she's female. And quite likely, you can't tell from the names anymore either. So some of the names that people have nowadays, you can't even tell that they're human. But I'm not going to go into that. So another one you'll hear is hi, hi. And typically you say hi, hi. You don't say he, or how would you say that all at once? Hi, hi, hi. I don't know how you would say it. Anyway, you hear people say hi, hi, and that is another one that comes from Morse code, and it's used to represent laughter. And so rather than saying ha ha, you'll hear people on the radio say hi, hi, because they want to be cool. And that's the cool lingo to use, right? And in Morse code, the letters HI is did it, which sounds a little bit like somebody laughing, is the rationality. I don't know if it really does or not, but that's the rationality. SK is one that we had to use recently when Mickey passed away, silent key. It refers to an operator who's passed away. They're no longer keying the radio, so they are a silent key, unfortunately. And then you'll hear
Use that one differently on Morse code.
that's right. In message trafficking, SK just means I'm done talking, right? I'm done with my message. So keep that in mind when you're talking, when you're using Morse code. That may not mean, oh, the other operator passed away while we were having our conversation. It just means that they ended their message.
It has a nice cadence to it.
Yeah. So that is one that you may hear in a different context.
Also, digital modes, PSK 31, FD8, use SK
For ending the message. So Dan points out that a lot of digital modes will use SK as an end of message marker. All right, and the last one I have on this page is DX, which basically refers to a distant contact or long range communication. So you hear people talk about, oh, I had a DX the other day where I was talking to France or something, right? They're talking about a conversation with some station that is far away from where they are. And you'll hear that sometimes on the repeaters when people will say, oh, are the bands open for DX right now? Or, how's 10 meters for DX? You'll hear things like that. And someone will say, oh, it's really open right now. You can hit the other side of the planet. Or no, the sun is very inactive right now. And there's no DX at all, right? So
There's a frequent combination of two of these on HF, and that's CQDX.
CQDX is another one where you're like, I'm calling CQ, but I want a distant station. I want somebody who's not, next door to me. I want to pick up a distant station. There are contests and things on the radio where one of them is like worked all states. So if you're here in Utah and you're trying to get worked all states, and say you've got 40 of them, and you don't want ones that are close to you, you want to get Alaska, Hawaii, Maine, Florida, whatever, you might request specifically for a DX station to respond. So. Okay. Now, the next part that we're going to talk about is some of the concepts and things that you will hear people use on the radio with the assumption that you know what they're talking about. And you may not know what they're talking about, especially if you're a newer ham. So in this case, we're just going to go through a few of these general terms and talk about them. First one is an operator. You'll hear people talk about being an operator, or I'm an amateur radio operator. The operator is the person using the radio. Okay. We also hear them talked about as a control operator, or you'll hear them used like in the context of a net as a net control operator, right? What they're talking about is the actual person who's using the radio. You'll hear the word frequency used. Frequency is pretty obvious, the frequency of the transmission in hertz, or kilohertz or megahertz, depending on what band you're on. In VHF and UHF land, you're generally talking about megahertz. You will also hear the frequency being used for CTCSS, the carrier continuous tone carrier coded squelch, continuous tone coded squelch system, something like that. And those will typically be in hertz, not in kilohertz or megahertz. So you'll hear, for example, on our repeater, the CTCSS tone is at 103.5 hertz. So that's the actual frequency of the signal, of the subaudible tone, is at 103.5 hertz. There's a tone at that frequency. And that frequency is so low that the human ear doesn't hear it. Now, some people might be able to hear tones that low. I don't.
That's actually in the audible range. It's just that the repeater won't, or that your radio won't pass it.
Yeah. So it's out of range for the bandwidth of the signal.
If you listen on an SDR receiver, often you'll hear those lower tones.
Paul points out that if you're listening on an SDR receiver, you might hear those tones on the repeater. So that's something to be interested figuring that out.
I mean, everybody's listened to a 60 hertz tone, that's a common
60 hertz hum. Yeah.
tone, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the,
Anybody who's used an old TV has probably heard that. All right. So another one is band. So when we talk about the bands, we talk about groupings of frequencies or a range of frequencies from one frequency to another that have a similar wavelength. So we'll talk about like the 2 meter band. The wavelength actually varies a little bit from exactly 2 meters, but it's close to that 2 meter length. So we talk about it as being the 2 meter band, for example. And you'll also hear about the 40 meter band, or you'll hear about 10 meter band is open or whatever, right? So basically that's just a word to use to group those frequency sets together, or identify collections of those frequencies, where they're at in that frequency and wavelength range. If you've passed the amateur technician test, you should know that the frequency and the wavelength are related. Basically, they are related to each other and the speed of light. So if you didn't know that and you have your license already, we should probably talk. But or maybe you got that question wrong. Okay, so you'll hear about things like band groupings. Oh, I skipped one. I skipped memory. So memory typically is a specific configuration of your radio that includes things like the frequency, the CTCSS tone, the offset, possibly other settings as well that are stored in your radio in a particular location. So most of the radios that you'll find nowadays have a couple of 100 memory slots available. And so you can program in all of this information. Then you don't have to punch in the frequency or remember the exact frequency of the repeater every time you want to use it. And you don't have to remember, oh, on this repeater, it's a positive offset. On this repeater, it's a negative offset, and punch that in correctly as well. You can store that in a memory location on your radio. And so you hear people talking about, well, program a memory for that, or, that I have that in memory location 27 or whatever. That's what they're talking about there. Let's talk about band groupings. And so again, when we talked about the bands, right, we talked about how that's related to the wavelength of the frequency, or a wavelength of the signal. Those bands fall into categories. The lowest ones are called low frequency, and those waves are 2 kilometers long. So if you picture the wave as the wave that is carrying the signal, from one peak to the next peak is 2,200 meters, 2 kilometers plus long. That is a low frequency, a very long wave. Amateur radio operators actually have privileges on that 2,200 meter band. So I don't know anybody who has equipment that works on that band, but if you happen to have your own submarine and you have a long wire to trail out behind it, you may find that you can use that.
I mean, a quarter wave antenna It's-
a quarter wave antenna would be 500 meters long, right? That's like 5 football fields long, plus a little bit, right? So
About submarines, they do have.
submarines do that. Yeah, Sherwood reminds me that submarines do trail a long wire antenna for exactly this purpose. And the bandwidth on the low frequency is pretty low, but you know, when you need to pick up a signal, no matter what, that one will definitely get through. You'll also see medium frequency or MF. Those are the bands from 630 meters up to 160 meters. And yes, we do have privileges on 630 meters and on 160 meters. HF is the high frequency bands, and that's typically what we're talking about using in amateur radio. Most of the time, we're going to be operating on high frequency. That's anything from 80 meters up to 10 meters. Then you have very high frequency, which covers the 6 meter, 2 meter, and 1.25 meter bands. And then ultra high frequency, which is 70 centimeters and above. Now, there are other frequencies that are higher than ultra high frequency. There's microwave, for example, and I mean 800 megahertz and so on up. And they have like, so above ultra high frequency, what is SHF, super high frequency. And there's another one that's even higher than that. Yes, ludicrous high frequency.
You ever see a chart that groups them by frequency? They go in powers of 10 beginning with a 3. So 30 to 300 is VHF. 300 to 3000 megahertz or 3 gigahertz
Is UHF.
So people talk about, I'll meet you on VHF. Well,
What band, right?
if you have a dual band handheld, that means one thing. But in the generic, 6 meters of VHF, so it's 1.25.
Right. So Paul points out that if you group them by frequency, they are in groups of what would that be? 1,000?
Well,
It's factors of 1,000, right? So like
What's a 10 multiplier? 3, 30, 300, 3,000.
30,000.
yeah, so like VHF would cover what 300 30 300 up to 300
Right.
330 300 no
That's why
From-
that's why the 1.25 is VHF.
right, because it's at 220,
It's 220.
so it's below the
30.
300,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So yeah, I think we should pull up a chart that shows that numerically, and then we
It
can
gets confusing talking about UHF because 70 centimeters, 33 centimeters, 23 centimeters.
those are all UHF. Yeah. So Paul points out that everything from the 70 centimeter, including the 23 centimeter and what was the other one? 33 and 23 centimeter are all considered UHF frequencies.
Wi-Fi is technically UHF.
And so your Wi-Fi frequencies at 2.4 gigahertz would be considered UHF. And what about the 5.8 gigahertz? That would be the next group, right? Whatever the next one up is, SHF or whatever, right? So you hear people talk about frequencies being above or below each other. And when we say above, we typically means higher frequencies, shorter wavelengths, or below being lower frequencies and higher wavelengths. So for example, 80 meters is below 40 meters, right? Because 80 meters frequency is lower than 40 meters frequency. Remember, it's a ratio, it's an inverse relationship. So as the frequency goes up, the wavelength goes down, and vice versa. As the frequency goes down, the wavelength goes up. So you'll hear people talk about, oh, that's above the frequency that I was, or the band that I was on, right? That's, just remember, above on bands means a band that's a lower number. That can be confusing sometimes. And then another one is gain. You'll hear people talk about the gain. Gain is amount of power increase, right? So an amplifier might give you some number of decibels of gain. A particular antenna system might give you some number of decibels of gain. Remember, decibels are measured in a logarithmic scale. So if something is giving you, what is it, 3 decibels is times 10?
100%.
That's times 2.
3 decibels is times
Times 2 or divided by 2, yeah.
2. So it doubles.
It's an increase of 100%.
So 3,
times 2.
yeah, so 3 dB gives you double the power. So if you gain 3 dB, you're gaining double the power, or the volume or whatever. You'll hear gain talked about in terms of audio signals as well. For example, your mic gain is too high. That means you can adjust your microphone maybe to not pick up as well, or turn its gain down, and then your signal will be clear. Okay.
Audio mixers have a gain.
Dan points out that mixers have a gain knob, typically for each channel, right? So you can adjust that. You can think about it as being like a power level or a volume level, but it's really more of an amplification level rather than just a volume level or attenuation level. How many people have like a stereo in their car and they know that it has a balance knob and a fader knob? Do you know the difference between those two?
Sure.
So like the balance, so if you're listening to a stereo signal, you've got 2 channels of audio coming at you, a left channel and a right channel. The balance knob allows you to put more of the volume or more of the power on one side or the other side of that. The fader knob is typically used to control the front to back balance, but it's not really a balance. You're just attenuating the signal that you don't want, right? There's no, in stereo, there's no concept of in front of you and behind you. So they call it a fader instead of a balance for the front to back. So that's just an interesting concept. Yes.
Just made the speakers in the back of the car.
If you fade it to the back, it's making the front speakers quieter. Then you turn your volume knob up to make the back speakers louder, right? Fading doesn't actually change, doesn't raise the volume anywhere. It just lowers it on the channel you're fading away from. So, okay. Another one is modes. You'll hear people talk about different modes of operation. Typically on VHF, UHF, we're going to be using FM, which is frequency modulation. On HF, you're going to be using single sideband or CW. The difference between these, so if we talk about FM, imagine you've got a signal or a carrier wave, right? And you wanted to carry some kind of signal. So the modulation, remember we talked about modulation before, the modulation is the signal. That's the information that you're trying to carry across that mechanism, right? That medium. And so what frequency modulation says is, hey, I'll just vary the frequency a little bit on either side of the center frequency, and that will carry my information. So if my modulation is high, I'll move my frequency up a little bit. And if it's low, I'll move it down a little bit. And I'm going to overlay the audio signal on top of this radio signal and modulate it in that fashion. So AM, on the other hand, amplitude modulation basically says the modulation of my signal, the information, is going to make my signal stronger or weaker. I'm going to turn the power up for a louder signal, and I'm going to turn it down for a lower signal. So there's a difference there in how those signals are actually put onto the radio waves themselves, right? When we talk about single sideband, imagine if you think about that AM signal, think of it like if you've seen a bell graph where you have the low bar and then it goes up and high and then middle and then it goes back down low on the other side. That's essentially the width of the signal that you're transmitting, right? So again, in FM, you're kind of shifting that middle portion left and right all the time. But in AM, you're making it bigger and smaller, right? With single sideband, you just get rid of half of it entirely, plus get rid of the carrier in the middle as well. And you only have the information on one side of that, a single sideband. You have the carrier in the middle, you have an upper sideband, and you have a lower sideband. So if you're on upper sideband, you're not sending the carrier and the lower signal, lower part of the signal. You're only sending the upper side. There's enough information in that to reconstruct the entire signal. Same thing on the lower sideband side. So
Well, and the reason why you do that,
there is a reason why we do that, right? And the reason is I don't have to pump out all that power on the carrier all the time. And so let's say I just got rid of just the carrier itself. I've probably cut the amount of power that I need to send out in half by doing that. Now, if I get rid of one of those sidebands, I've cut down the power that I'm using by 1/4. So I'm actually using 1/4 of the power that I would be for that full AM signal. And a lot of times you'll see on a new radio, oh, look, I've got my HF radio. It'll do 100 watts single sideband and 25 watts AM. And you think, well, why only 25 watts AM? Well, because the circuitry is in there to produce this much power. But when it's only putting it out on the single sideband, it's like it's 4 times as powerful. So that's where the 100 watts comes from. Yeah. There's no dumb questions, only dumb answers.
Talking so much about bands. What is the physical characteristic of radio?
Oh, let's save that question for the end because I've got another presentation that actually shows. Well, I can pull it up and we can go through it exactly, and then I can point it out to you. But save it. Don't forget that question. Don't let me forget it. Okay. Bruce, did you have a comment?
That's a kind of tricky concept.
It is. It's a tough concept for beginners to grasp, but there's math and everything, right? Back to modes. We talk about CW. CW is continuous wave. Basically, the radio is transmitting or it's not transmitting. When it's transmitting a continuous wave. And that's where CW comes from. It stands for continuous wave. So when you hit your Morse code key and you tap it, every time you tap it, you're transmitting something. When you untap it, you're not transmitting. And the radio will send that out as a broken signal, right? Here's the signal. And it's either transmitting or it's not transmitting. The receiving radio will detect that and play a little tone for you so you know that it's actually receiving that. The tone kind of correlates with the frequency, and so if you're tuning around on HF and you hear like boop, 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 and you tune in closer and it goes boop, 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 and then it goes too high and you go past it, right? So you'll hear it actually change, or the other way around. Is that the other way around?
Yeah.
The other way around. Yeah. So what the signal is on a particular frequency, you can hear it a little bit off on either side because of the properties of the shape of this wave, right? So
well, CW waves are only like 300.
they're pretty small.
hertz
Yeah,
wide
they're pretty narrow.
versus 3 kilohertz wide.
Right.
Faster you send, the wider the band.
Yes, it's true too. You can receive slow CW with a filter that's only 30 hertz or 50 hertz wide. Well, when somebody starts sending faster, it can't follow the key.
The changes, it can't follow the changes. So Bruce and Paul point out that when you send code faster, it uses more bandwidth. And that's because of the fact that if you're looking at a very restricted section of that bandwidth, you filtered off the top and bottom and you've got it narrowed down so far. If it's a fast signal, you don't have enough information to tell when it's starting and stopping, basically. So
CW is actually a digital mode. And
yes,
that principle continues
through the rest of digital modes, right? CW, as Paul points out, CW is a digital mode, right? It's either on or it's off. It's like binary. It's either 0 or 1. So you're either transmitting or you're not. It's like the lowest end digital mode you can possibly get.
Well, one thing you can explain too, that on CW and SSB, the radio does the equivalent of reinserting the carrier. So that makes it intelligible. It makes it, you hear a tone on CW, it makes it.
Yeah, your radio does that, right? Your radio is actually generating that tone.
It's not
Because remember, the carrier's not there. Yeah, the carrier's not there because it's single sideband, right? So no. Anyway, All right, so then we've got digital modes. And as we mentioned, CW is a digital mode, but basically with digital modes, you've converted some kind of analog signal, which could be letters that you're sending, into some kind of digital format. Typically, it could be digitized voice, it could be images. There's a lot of different things it could be. We'll talk about some specific digital modes right here. So ones that you will encounter are DMR, D-Star, System Fusion, and P25. You might encounter those on VHF bands, on the 2 meter or 70 centimeter bands or wherever, right? Basically, these are ways of encoding your signal into a digital format, and then it sends that digital format over the air. So why would we do that? You guys remember old TV before HDTV became a thing? And how it could be really fuzzy, but you could still kind of make out Johnny Carson at the desk there, and what was his Ed McMahon sitting next to him, and you could almost make out one was Johnny and one was Ed, but you couldn't really tell which was which. That never happens with HDTV, right? It never happens with digital television, because with the digital signal, there's a couple of things that go on. There's the information is sent, and additional information is sent that helps you know if you got all of the bits correctly. We call this error code correction, right? ECC. And there's different types of ECC that can be used. The simplest one is the parity bit. If you've ever worked with computer modems, you remember, oh, it's 7-bit even parity or odd parity. Parity bit basically will tell you, hey, a bit was wrong, but it won't tell you which one. But by adding additional bits of parity of this ECC, you can actually tell which bits were wrong and fix them, which is kind of cool. And so what these digital modes do is basically you either are receiving enough of the signal to have a picture on your TV, or you're not, and you don't get a picture, right? So a lot of times nowadays you will see like the picture goes all blocky, and that's because of the underlying protocol that's being used to encode the images. So you're picking up some of them, enough to fill in some of the picture, but not all of it. Those are just factors of how it does that. But again, you're not going to see like snow, like we used to see snow on the TV, or hear static. You're never going to get that on the digital signal. And so our digital voice modes are the same way. You're either going to receive it and it's going to be perfect, or you're not going to receive it at all. Okay.
Or you're gonna receive it and it'll be pixelated because the blocks were not.
That's not going to happen on DMR, for example, on the amateur radio, right? Because that signal is either received correctly or the radio will reject it and it won't bother to play it. It won't bother to put it out the speaker.
The bit error rate has to reach a certain point before it'll reject it. You can have some pretty, sounds like somebody's gargling or robotic, it's been distorted in some.
Some protocols will do that, where they will actually downgrade the signal and they'll basically mask off more of your audio in order to be able to get some of it to go through, depending on the error rate that they're encountering. But in general, with most of these digital systems, you're either going to receive it and it's going to sound great, or you're not going to receive it at all. So ones that we've talked about in here, we've talked about DMR. We had a class where the guy from what was that company that sells all the DMR stuff? Bridgecom. The guy from Bridgecom gave us a presentation on DMR and talked about that. Other systems that are similar to that but slightly different are D-Star. System Fusion is a Yaesu thing that does this. P25 is the system that's typically used by public service radios. Sometimes you will find public service radios repurposed into use as amateur radios, and they may be on a P25 system. So those are.
Utah Communications Authority is this September is transitioning the entire state's public service emergency responders to a common P25 linked system with 144 sites.
Nice.
It's yes,
but are they turning encryption on at the same time?
I don't know.
So Paul points out that UCAN, who runs the statewide communications network for public service is transitioning to a statewide linked repeater system that basically, if you, won't matter where you are in the state, if you switch to the correct talk group, you'll be able to communicate with anybody else on that talk group in the state, right? So that will be interesting to see what happens when they do that. It will bear some interesting changes, I'm sure. This is one of the reasons why we exist here in Murray, is because if there's a emergency, disaster or whatever, and everybody in the state is trying to talk on UCAN, chances are good nobody will actually be able to get a message through. And so we are here as a backup for our city, for our public service radios. We are here to help our fire department be able to actually communicate with each other in the event that the public system is not functional or not usable. Let's talk about some other digital modes. So packet, we've talked about packet radio before. What that is basically just a way of having digitized information collected into little chunks of information called packets and sent from radio to radio. So with packet, you can actually route information from one radio to another radio to another radio. So say I want to get a message to Dan while he's up at his cabin or up at his property, but I can't reach him directly, but there's a couple of stations in between that are running gateways. I can route my packet through those stations and maybe get to it. So that's an interesting thing about packet radio. APRS is a utilization of packet radio where they've kind of modified it a little bit. They've changed some of the things in the protocol to be more effective as a local tactical solution. APRS stands for Automatic Packet Reporting System. And we've talked about that before as well. ATV, amateur television. So I know that used to be really popular here in Salt Lake. There was an amateur television repeater up on one of the mountains. I don't know if it is still there or not. I don't remember. I thought it was up on one of the hills over here, but I could be wrong. Anyway, basically what amateur television is it's just what you think. It's actual television signals being sent on amateur radio frequencies, and you can actually receive them on a television and watch that video. They actually use frequencies that are the same frequencies that used to be used on cable. So if you remember back in the old days, you would have your TV and you would set it either for antenna or cable. And what that would do is it would change the band that the particular channels above channel 13 were on. So what we used to call the UHF channels on the antenna, they would be on a particular UHF frequency. On cable, they were on a different frequency set of frequencies within the cable system. The amateur TV actually happens to correspond to that cable setting. And it just so happens that the frequencies that were used happen to fall within the amateur radio bandwidth allocation. I don't remember which one it is. We should probably do a class on it if we can find somebody around here that's still doing it. Maybe get a guest speaker who's interested in doing a presentation on that.
You used to be able to bring up on your TV and big antenna.
And pick it up, yeah.
But now the TV's gonna digital.
Now the TVs, so a lot of TVs still can be set for the old antenna analog mode.
Well, when they scan it.
Yeah. But some of the newer ones maybe can't do that. I don't know. Then there's slow scan TV, which if you think about that, think about sending still pictures. Yeah, it's like I've got a picture, I'm gonna scan it, I'm gonna transmit line by line my picture, and when you're receiving that on the other end, you're slowly watching the picture fade in or fill in as it receives each line of it. And then when it's done, it wipes it out and starts a new one, right? So it's using television technology, but it's not like running at 60 hertz. So you can't actually, sit there and watch it like a video. It's very slow. People used to use that a lot. I don't see it used too much anymore, thanks to the digital modes, the other digital modes that we have available, and the ability to say, take a JPEG file and send it digitally as a file attachment rather than as an image. But the technology is still there. And there was recently a thing where the space station was transmitting some set of images. I can't remember how many there were like 13 or something like that, different images that they were sending as they orbited the Earth. And people tried to pick those up and decode them. And your mileage may vary on how that looks. It can look really bad. It can look okay, but you got to realize how much data is actually part of a television picture. It's a lot more than you think. Fax is another one, which is basically fax machine. If you've ever picked up the phone while a fax machine is sending a fax and you hear those tones, you can send those tones over the radio just as well as you can send them over the telephone system. And fax is typically, or was used a lot for weather information. So you might have a ship out at sea and it's receiving actual, weather reports in fax format with pictures of the clouds or the wind patterns or whatever, pressures and things like that, directly as a fax, and it comes in over the radio, which is kind of cool. And then RTTY, RTTY is a radio teletype. If you guys know anybody who's deaf and they have a teletype system that they use with their phone, it's basically doing that same thing, but doing it over the radio instead of over the phone system. So it converts the digital signal, and TTY is, I think, a 5-bit code. So it's not even ASCII, it's just like 5 bits for each character. And so RTTY does that same thing over the radio. Okay. So another concept that you'll hear people assume you know something about is antennas. When we talk about different types of antennas, and people will assume you know what they're talking about when they are talking about a Yagi antenna, for example, or a vertical or a beam antenna. So a vertical is just what it says. It's an antenna that goes straight up and down. And why would we use something like that? We use it on our handhelds all the time, right? Basically, if you think about how the wave is coming off of that antenna, it's going to be oriented in such a way that it travels vertically, and a vertical antenna will pick up a signal that was transmitted by a vertical antenna. A horizontal antenna will probably still pick it up, but not as good. So sometimes you'll hear people when they're talking on the radio and it sounds really scratchy or really rough, and you tell them, well, hold your radio straight up and down and your signal might get a little better, right? That's because you want to bring that antenna in line in vertical so that the signal is being able to be received by the antenna on the repeater. A beam antenna is any antenna that wants to send the signal in a particular direction. So typically you will see, if you're driving around, I know when I first got my license, I suddenly saw hundreds of radio towers on people's houses or behind people's houses that I had never noticed before. I've driven through this neighborhood a dozen times. I've never noticed that guy had a big antenna on the back of his house. Now you will see that, right? It's just like when you buy a new car, suddenly you see those cars everywhere you go and you're like, oh shoot, everybody's got a Subaru, or everybody's got a Jeep or whatever. When you get your license and you start thinking about radio, now you're seeing antennas. The typical beam antenna is the one you'll see on top of the tower that's got like a center bar. It looks kind of like an H, right? It's got 2 elements. One is the powered element, and the other is kind of a directional element, right? So if you think about that, you think about how is the signal coming off of that. It's actually coming off of the one thing and going towards the other one. You think about that as a transmitting element and a director. So it's like, it's not coming like off of the pointy part of the H, it's coming off of the flat part of the H. And depending on how it's pointing, it could go more in one direction than the other direction. We could talk about Smith charts at some point. That would be an interesting class to do, but probably not for the beginner class. You probably ought to do that for a more advanced class. A Yagi is a specialized type of beam antenna. It's typically going to have more of those elements. It may have a driven element, a reflector element behind that, and then one or more directing elements in front of that, right? So You'll see people use a Yagi for direction finding, like in fox hunts or something like that. And basically it's an extremely directional antenna, and its properties are such that it really wants the signal to go in one particular direction.
That's also what's used for,
TV antennas are often Yagi antennas, right? Back in the day, you used to have a knob on top of your TV, and when you switch to channel whatever, like, oh, I'm going to switch to channel 5, I would turn this knob to point my antenna at where channel 5's transmitter was. And then, oh, now I'm going to switch to channel 2. Well, their transmitter's on a different mountaintop. I'm going to turn my knob and point my antenna at a different place. In amateur radio, we use those rotators as well, specifically to point our signal in a particular direction. Loop antennas, those are kind of interesting. They have an interesting property where they are directional in like 2 different directions, and it's not through the middle of the loop. That's the null. So if you think about that, if I've got my loop and I point it at Dan, so I'm looking through the loop at Dan, he's not going to hear the signal because the most of the signal is going out to the sides. He's in the dead spot.
Isn't it just the opposite?
No, that's not true.
Never.
It's the edge.
I always thought the null was,
The null's on here's the loop, and that's the direction.
Yeah.
Make a distinction between a big loop, like a delta loop or a quad or something, and what's called a small transmitting loop or a mag loop. On the very small loop, there's a very sharp null on the axle of the wheel.
Yeah.
On a large loop, it's a significant portion of the wavelength. It's directional broadside.
So Paul points out that on a larger loop, the direction is actually through the loop as opposed to along the edge of the loop. So I was not aware of that. You also hear people talk about antenna arrays where they've got multiple antennas. Typically, you'll hear this in the context of like Earth, Moon, Earth signaling, where you're going to transmit a signal, bounce it off the moon, and have it come back to the Earth. And you'll see setups where they've got like 4 directional antennas that are mounted on a rig that can be moved up and down and left and right. And they send the same signal out on all 4 of those antennas. Another time you'll see it is in direction finding. Again, I've seen this where there's actually hardware that you can buy that has like 4 antennas on it, and you mount those on the roof of your vehicle. And depending on how the signal comes into those, it'll actually show you on a display what direction the signal is coming from. If you've ever been interested in aviation, they use a system called a VOR, which is a directional system like that, where it can actually tell you the direction bearing you are from the VOR transmitter. So when you're flying in your plane, you can see, I'm going to dial in this VOR and I can see, oh, it's over there. And I know how far away it is and where it's at, right? There's directional and distance measuring equipment encoded in that signal. A dipole, your typical dipole is basically just usually a piece of wire. They call it a dipole because you bring the signal into it from the middle, and one end of it is the powered side and one end of it is the ground plane side. So you'll also see things like an end-fed dipole, which you're feeding the signal in from one end and you let the ground be the ground plane, right? But those are other types of antennas that you'll encounter. An NVIS, near vertical incidence skywave antenna. When we talked about HF, we talk about the signal propagating by bouncing around the Earth between the ground and the ionosphere. An NVIS antenna is designed to minimize that or try to keep the signal close to you. It's for having close communications. These things only really apply in HF. We don't use anything like this in VHF typically. And then the last one I have on here is a hex beam. You'll hear people talk about the hex beam antenna. Oh, I've got a fancy hex beam antenna. The benefit of the hex beam is it typically works on a lot of different bands without having to monkey around with it or adjust anything. It's a very wide bandwidth antenna. It handles, how many bands does your hex beam have, Dan?
5.
So 5 bands all in one antenna, right?
And they use a reflector and a driven element.
Yeah, so they'll use a reflector, as Dan points out, a reflector and a driven element as well. Okay, so the last thing that I have, is Technobabble. We talked about Technobabble being one of the things we were going to talk about. So the definition of Technobabble is incomprehensible technical jargon. Okay, so for an example, you may hear this on Star Trek. The Heisenberg compensator adjusts the phase interface for the multi-channel tachyon particle streams. That's a nice technobabble phrase that doesn't actually mean anything, right? You will hear things on the radio that you just don't understand what they're talking about, right? Somebody will say something, they'll be talking about something, and they'll use something, some phrase or some jargon, and you have no idea what they're talking about because you don't have that background, you don't have that technical knowledge. People will assume you know things that you don't. And the topic may be something that, you're not familiar with, maybe photography or auto mechanics or computers or something like that. If you don't know or you don't understand what they're talking about, ask them. Most people are really happy to explain what they're talking about. In fact, they love to talk. That's why we're amateur radio operators and why we talk on the radio. We enjoy talking to people, right? So if somebody is using a phrase, you have no idea what they're talking about, you don't know what they're talking about, then by all means ask them, hey, you said QST, what the heck do you mean by that? They'll tell you, right?
If it's quantum physics, they won't understand even after you.
That's very possible. Bruce points out that if we start talking about, is that an up quark, down quark? There's like 6 different kinds. There's up, down, happy and mad. I don't know. There's
So it's quantum computers can be one
or something else, right? Yeah. So when you start getting into quantum mechanics, even after they've explained it, not only do you not understand it, but they probably don't understand it either. Okay, so other things, you tell me if there's something you've heard that you don't know about or don't understand, or have somebody's used a phrase or a word on the radio and you don't know what it is, let me know. We'll add it to this presentation. We'll figure it out together. So if I don't know it, I'll figure it out. I'll find a way to find out for you. So please feel free to tell me if you encounter something that you don't understand on the radio. Our goal in this club is to make people better amateur radio operators and to help those who have less knowledge gain more knowledge, right? So get better at what you're doing. If you're already really good, then you're the one who's supposed to be sharing your knowledge with other people. Okay. So nobody lives in a vacuum. We are out here to get information, give information, and everybody learn something and share what you know. So if there's something you've heard, you don't know what it means, ask somebody, talk to me about it. We'll figure it out. Okay. That's the end of the presentation. And once again, we are almost right at 8 o'clock. So this should have been 2 presentations up front. So
We're gonna talk about frequency.
So yes, we can talk about frequencies. Let me see if I can't pull this up. Let's do this. Let me get a.
If you want the MARC, actually,
Let me
Wikipedia has a good thing on,
do this. Let me close
has
this.
a GIF on, how it works.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. And I'm going to change this a little bit. Okay. So give me a second here. I can change this. Bear with me. Please. We can go in here.
While he's looking that up, for those interested, we've already had a presentation on modes. And it talks about
Okay.
what the waveforms look like. And it has an animation for that, so.
Yeah, let's see if we can pull that up here. Hang on. Let me get this sharing again. Okay. And then I'm gonna get a new browser window. Okay. Yeah, we're good. All right, so this is the club website. I can actually make this a little smaller now. We can actually see it. Okay, can everybody see that? So do you remember what that was called, Dan?
Just do a search for modes.
This one. And I don't have the presentation. You didn't send me the presentation. Why didn't you send me the presentation? Okay. Let's go in here. So we have some stuff. This was way back in the early days. We had some stuff back here. Let me see if this. Okay, here we go. So this is from a presentation Dan gave a while ago. When we talk about radio waves, we talk about electromagnetic radiation, right? So there's actually two fields that are involved. There's an electric field and a magnetic field. That's what we call it. I've already lost you.
We use the word radiation.
Okay, so radiation is basically just something being sent out, right? So if you think about it, the lights are radiating visible light down on top of us. The sun is radiating stuff at us. Your radiator at home radiates heat out of it, right? It transmits that out of it. So when we're talking about radio, that's radiating at radio waves, right? Does that make sense?
I think it was, I'm visualizing, traveling through space at warp speed.
Okay, so think about that, but traveling at light speed instead of at warp speed, right? So when I have my radio and I'm transmitting a signal, information is leaving my radio and it's traveling away from my radio in all directions, right? At the speed of light, because it's an electromagnetic radiation. Light is an electromagnetic radiation. X-rays, gamma rays, any of those are what we call electromagnetic radiation. And so if you think about that as just being like, if I turn on my flashlight, it radiates a beam of energy away from it. It's the same thing. It's radiating, or radiation. The light is radiation coming out of my flashlight and shining on something, right? So in electromagnetic field, you can think of it as an electric field crossed at 90 degrees with a magnetic field. Okay. So what this does is this can carry information. We have, so you've got a certain amount of magnetism involved and a certain amount of electrical potential involved in this, right? And electricity and magnetism kind of go together. They like each other a lot. And trying to think of how the best way to explain the physics of that. And I can't, there really isn't a good best way to explain it. But if you think about this kind of information, and I think I've actually got, all right, well, let's go through a little bit more of this. So the wavelength, if you think about that, that information is going in a wave like pattern, right? So it starts out and it goes up and down and then up and down continuously as it goes along, right? So the wavelength is the distance, the physical distance between the two peaks of that wave. So think about if you're on the ocean and you're looking at waves on the ocean, there's a wavelength there, right? If I've got a wave here and the water is moving in this wave, if you think about it with the ocean, think about it like this. If I'm out on the ocean and I take something that's going to float and I put it on top of the wave, as the wave moves along, does the thing move? It moves up and down with the water, but it doesn't move along with the wave. The wave is the information that is traveling, but the water itself isn't traveling. It's the same kind of thing with this electromagnetic radiation, right? So the this field is, you could visualize it as moving, even though nothing is actually physically moving, just the information is moving along. Okay. And so as we talk about our wavelength, when we talk about being on the 2 meter band, the wave is about 2 meters long, about 6 feet long. Okay. So from one point at the top of one hill or one top of one wave to the top of the next wave, as this wave is moving, it's carrying information, right? That wavelength is where our wavelength comes from. And the frequency is like the opposite of that. So if I'm standing there and I'm watching waves go by and I'm counting the waves as they go by, a certain number of waves will go by in a minute, for example. Well, when we talk about our frequency, we talk about 147.12 megahertz. So we're saying that if I'm standing at this one point, I see 147.12 million waves go past me every second. Okay. So remember, these things are traveling at the speed of light, right? This information is traveling at the speed of light. So it goes really fast. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about that. Let's see. There was another one. Was it in here? I can't remember if it's in this one or the other one.
You just gotta count really fast.
Yeah, you got to count really fast, right? So this is talking about like the size of the wave, right? The amplitude. When we talk about amplitude modulation or AM, remember we were talking about how that's the size of the wave or the amount of energy in the wave. So if you're out on the ocean and your swells are 3 feet high, that's a lot different from your swells being 20 feet high, right? Your 20-foot high swells have a lot more energy in them than your 3-foot high swells. Okay. So the same thing applies in radio waves. The higher the amplitude, the more energy is in my wave, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, now I'm talking about power, right? So the amount of energy or the amount of power in my wave is going to define how high this wave is, essentially, how tall it is from like a center point. So how tall above and below, remember, because the wave goes up and down, right? So as it goes along. So when we talk about like amplitude modulation, we're adjusting how high that wave is. So either it's higher or lower, depending on how we've modulated it. So when we're talking on AM, we modulate that amplitude, that strength of the signal. Now, when we're talking on FM, we change the wavelength, the distance changes between peak to peak, and we're carrying the information in that distance rather than in the height of the signal. So the signals are all the same height in FM. They're at a particular level of power, but we vary the frequency to carry the information that we want.
Is that power called watts?
That power is measured in watts, yeah. So power is measured in watts. So if you talk about, when we start talking about electricity and electronics and things, you've got a few different things that go together, right? You've got current, which is like how much electricity is flowing through a wire. That measures the current, right? And then you've got voltage, which is how hard it's pushing, how much strength is behind it. Now, if you multiply those two together, you get the power or the watts. So your voltage times your amperage is your wattage, right? Yeah, exactly. Or it's not Ohm's law. Ohm's law is relating to resistance, but it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, Watt's law. So that measurement of power is, remember, we talked about power as being the ability to do work, right? So when you want to do something, you need to use power to do it. If I'm going to pick my phone up, I have to expend some amount of power to move my phone from here to here, right? Because I'm overcoming the force of gravity that wants to keep it there. When I lift it, I've used power to do that. Now, when I'm just holding it like this, technically no power is being consumed because it's not moving. In reality, my muscles are trying to keep from having it fall down again. So they're still working, right? I'm still using power to do that. But there's no power inherent in the system that my phone is, it's not experiencing any power activity right now.
I mean, you learned a long time ago, work equals force times distance, right?
Right.
So that directly correlates.
Yeah. So that power feeds into the radio signal as well, right? How much power are we allowed to use in ham radio on our radio signal? Talk about peak envelope power, or the total amount of power that we're able to use is 1,500 watts, right? That's a lot of power when you think about it. How many watts does your handheld have?
18.
It depends on the radio, right? Some have more than others. My radio in the car will do 50 watts on VHF. It'll only do 20 watts on the 1.25 meter band, though. And it'll do 40 watts on UHF on the 70 centimeter band. But my handheld will do a maximum of 5 watts at a minimum of like half a watt or something like that. My cell phone probably puts out, what do you want to say, maybe a quarter of a watt?
No, way less than that.
Eighth of a watt.
We're talking milliwatts.
So hardly anything. How does my cell phone work? Well, it works because there's a tower 50 feet away over there. No matter where I am, there's a tower less than a couple of miles away from me. So even though it has hardly any power, it's still enough to get the signal to that next tower. What if the phone system stops working?
No, is a radio.
Exactly. God, I'm trying to find, there's a lot of good information in here, but this isn't the one that I was looking for. Let me see. Maybe it was. I don't know. Let's do this. See if there's a good image for this. One of these was actually like a moving image, which kind of gives you a feel
If you
for.
go to the Wikipedia page on there, they have a good GIF showing that.
What am I looking for? Electromagnetic waves?
Yeah, electromagnetic. And I think if you just click on it, there it is.
There we go. Okay. So here's one that kind of shows this, how this wave is moving, right?
3D.
So remember, there's an electric portion of this and a magnetic portion, and they're like 90 degrees related to each other. But as this signal goes through, that wave is moving in both directions at the same time. Now you'll see things where a signal will be like vertically polarized or horizontally polarized or circularly polarized, I've seen. And that just relates to how that wave is being sent out, right? It's either being sent out vertically or horizontally or rotating as it goes along. So
Lagoon tried to make a ride like that.
okay.
Hey, I appreciate you doing this. I asked you what time it is. You're telling me I'll go to watch.
Okay.
No, I appreciate it. I don't want to keep you guys any longer.
We're good, I think.
Oh,
There's a circular one right there, right? So that's It says this is the electric field vector of a wave of circularly polarized electromagnetic radiation. So they're only showing you the electric part, but keep in mind that there's a corresponding magnetic part that would be following this along, right along with it, kind of like,
Perpendicular.
yeah. Yeah,
Which is hard to.
which is hard to visualize circularly, right? But yeah, there's the technology is just amazing, and to realize that this has been, happening in the universe, and now we have been able to tap into it, and the things that like Marconi figured out, like, oh geez, if I have a thing over here and I make an electric spark, and then I have another thing over here, when I make an electric spark over here, an electric spark happens over here, and there's nothing even touching that. How does that happen? And he figured out how that happens. And from that came all of our radio technology that we use today. It's really quite incredible. It really is. A lot of great stuff. So anyway, there was another thing. Where did that go? There's another thing we were going to talk about at the end. You guys remember what that was? I can't remember what that was.
The spectrum. EHF and UHF and other things that they call them spectrum.
Oh, so I think that was actually in Dan's presentation. Let's see. This one. Let's run through here real quick. Okay, so here's the radio frequency spectrum, right? See if I can make this a little bigger. So you can see way down here at 30 hertz, you've got your very low frequency, then your low frequency, then your medium frequency. And you can see how these line up, right? The medium frequency is from 300 kilohertz up to 3 megahertz. The low frequency is from 30 kilohertz up to 300 kilohertz. You've got high frequency here, HF. You got very high frequency, 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz, we talked about. Ultra high frequency goes up to 3 gigahertz. Then there's super high frequency, which goes up to 30 gigahertz. And then extra high frequency goes up to 300 gigahertz. And then what's next? Infrared radiation. And infrared radiation basically goes from 300 gigahertz all the way up until you hit visible light, which is up in this terahertz range, right? What's above tera? Peta. Yeah. So 3 petahertz up here, visible light kind of lands in between 300 terahertz and 3 petahertz. But above that, there's even more. There's X-rays, there's gamma rays. And, if you think about how much, is actually happening out there, it just kind of blows your mind a little bit sometimes. So this is how the frequencies are allocated in the US. And you can see there are some big chunks that are for like broadcast TV, right? If we look at this color scale over here, you'll see.
Look at each row there, you can see 30 megahertz, 300 megahertz.
Oh, yeah.
So that is also separated by UHF, VHF.
So anything you see in here that's green, that's our stuff, amateur, right? So we have a pretty healthy chunk right here below broadcast TV. And then as you move along, you'll find other spots where we have stuff, right? So any of these green ones are amateur radio. So like this would be the 1.25 meter band. And like
refer to it as VHF, but it's not just what our allocation is in the
there's other things in there too, right? Yeah. So like you look on here and you'll see all these different users.
You're looking at right there.
Well, I was up here around what is this? Oh yeah, so it's under 30 minutes. So this would be the one where the VHF is, right? So from 30 megahertz up to 3 gigahertz,
Actually,
right?
yeah, I was looking at the wrong line, so.
Let's see. So you can see how this is actually used. It's there's a lot happening in here, right? There's a lot of different users of this frequency spectrum. A lot of guys figured it out.
Crazy.
You'll hear sometimes like the FCC wants to auction off some frequencies, right? What they'll do is they'll pick a part of this spectrum and they'll sell it to some business for their use. So for example, when what was it? T-Mobile was trying to get some space for their 5G stuff. They needed a frequency range to do that in. And so there was a big deal. Was AT&T going to get it? Was T-Mobile going to get it? You know, who was going to get it? So some of these they could actually use both of them, right? Both companies can use it. It's shared. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's pretty cool.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks for coming, guys. And I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to stop the recording. And we'll see you guys later. Thanks.